Don't apologize. I don't care anymore. Don't care. End of message.
The voice of Maria Sanuti Spencer, a daughter of the mob.
I was just thinking about how it relates to Sopranos. I was like, oh, like Meadow could have been this person, learning from her dad.
Maria was a daddy's girl, and Daddy is a man comfortable with mafia methods.
I think Rocco left Frank with the message that any further disputes between him and his daughter could result in Frank getting hurt or even killed.
Frank Spencer was found lying dead in a pool of his own blood. Had Maria Sanuti Spencer learned enough from her father to be made for murder?
You don't win unless I let you in. Do you understand? You don't win, Spencer.
Probing the mind and the timeline of killers, this series reveals the red flags of those who will one day be investigated for taking a life. Maria Sanuti is from a large Italian-American family. Forensic psychologist Judy Ho has been analysing the motivation for murder that would one day appear on her timeline.
Maria grew up around violence, and her father solved all of his problems with violence. So it's not surprising that Maria would take the same approach. This is how she gets people to listen and to respect her.
Maria's father was Rocco Franklin. Rocco was an individual who had essentially resided in state prison for a majority of his adult life.
He's kind of known as a tough guy, and some people think he's a wise guy, like maybe he's got some mob connections. She doesn't have any problem with her dad being a tough guy.
Maria's mother, Teresa, divorced Rocco, leaving New Jersey to set up home with her children in Pennsylvania. It was where Maria would meet her future husband. There are some who believe Maria is innocent of the crimes she's now serving time for, including her lawyer, Christian Howie, a man who knows her story.
Frank and Maria met in Columbia County, where Frank and his family ran their junkyard business. Frank was a very popular individual in that area. It's a small county, a small area, and everybody knew everybody, and certainly everybody knew Frank.
In 1997, they elope. Frank says she's beautiful and she's smart, and he loves that she brings out this sense of adventure in him. And, it's just, she's more spontaneous than I've ever been, he says. Over the years, they have 2 children, Cyrus, their son, and Frankie, their daughter.
By the early noughties, Maria and Frank looked like they were living the classic all-American family life.
They had 2 lovely children. Both of them very athletic and prominent in their community. Each of the kids had a great deal of friends.
Things, though, were not what they seemed for the couple.
Frank and Maria, by all accounts, had a very acrimonious relationship. They were at odds with each other constantly. Making up and breaking up seemed to be the course of their marriage.
I think when Maria and Frank first met, they were attracted to each other for similar reasons. I think they felt like the other person gave them something that maybe they really craved and wanted, and they were both adventurous at the time and were living these fast-paced lives. After marriage, Frank became domesticated very quickly, and I think it caused Maria to lose respect and possibly fall out of love with him and not respect him.
It just seemed that Frank and Maria's marriage was really suffering from a great deal of bickering and infighting between them. So it was a difficult marriage, by all accounts.
Maria wanted control of her husband's life, something not made easy when Frank had to devote more time to work.
Frank's father decides to retire in 2006. Frank, at that point, takes over the family business, which is a junkyard. And, he's a good guy, and he treats all the employees like family. So this is this whole new family that's coming into their world now, and Maria's not so sure she likes it. She's just not cut out for this.
On top of being domesticated, Frank took on more of the role of a caregiver, which probably Maria wasn't really used to in terms of her own upbringing.
Things went bad quickly. Tensions led to violence.
The police were called several times as this violence escalated. At one point, the police were called on Maria for assaulting the mother of Frank at a school.
The local police had been involved in numerous domestic disputes between the two individuals, property damage, property theft, each one pointing the finger at the other.
Maria was described as the Black Widow by associates and acquaintances, and certainly had this reputation where she thought that she was above the law.
There was constant fighting between them, some issues regarding infidelity between themselves and both of them.
As court documents would reveal, the volatile relationship took up a lot of police time. Frank Spencer reported his wife's violence to the authorities between 25 and 35 times over 6 years up to 2012. On numerous occasions, both when married and later when separated, he would tell them she threatened to kill him.
When these incidents would happen, Frank would call the police. He wanted it noted, he wanted it on record, but he didn't really want to press charges on her.
It was in 2006 when Frank Spencer decided enough was enough. He began the divorce process, but he didn't leave Maria. That would come years later.
The couple continues to live together. They're trying to keep things as normal for the children as they can. So they're still living in the same house, trying to keep things looking the same.
Even though they actually kind of physically separated from each other, there were many times where they reconciled. Let's say between, 2007 and 2010. Maria would return to the family home for months. They would have another disagreement. The police might get involved. They had many of those make-up, break-up, reconciliation moments.
Oftentimes, when people decide to carry on when they've fallen out of love and still stay in the relationship, there's a real purpose to it. And I think Maria probably didn't see the point. I think she didn't particularly like rules and didn't like to be confined. And the fact that she felt like she was stuck in this position where she had to so pretend that her and Frank were okay and that they were in love and that they were a partnership probably just caused her more and more resentment over time, and she blamed Frank for all of it.
Despite the issues, Maria told friends that she didn't want to divorce Frank. It would be bad for her image, interfere with her access to the children.
She's told people over the years that if he ever threatened to divorce her, she'd kill him. Well, now she's talking more and more openly about what she wants to do.
In 2007, Frank first reported one of Maria's threats that she'd have her father kill Frank. Despite Hemlock police knowing all about the warring couple, Maria sometimes managed to present a reasonable face to the world. Frank, too, would hear his wife's phone messages attempting to placate him during the many times they were fighting.
Saturday, February 6th at 3:57 p.m. Hey, Frank, it's Maria. Listen, I know for some strange reason you'll think that I was attempting to threaten you, or I was attempting to scare you back to me, or I don't know how your mind works, but listen, I know you and I are done. I haven't seen you in 2 weeks except for court. Every day I get a little better with it.
Soft words from a hard woman, schooled in the ways of the mob by her own father.
The more that she developed a disrespect for Frank, the more she thought of him as this little prey, this little victim that she could continue to instill her anger and her resentment on.
And when the daughter of the mob felt resentful, those around her better watch out, especially Frank. Maria Sanuti Spencer's willingness to get tough didn't stay inside the family home.
In 2008, Maria is arrested when she causes a disturbance at the school where her daughter attends. She goes to pick up her daughter, and her mother-in-law shows up at the same time, and she gets in a scuffle with her. Maria is charged with disorderly conduct, harassment, and endangering a child because she doesn't buckle up the child in the car. By law, she's supposed to do that. Eventually, the prosecutor doesn't think he can really make all those cases, so he arranges a plea deal, and she pleads to disorderly conduct, and she pays a $600 fine.
During the scuffle, Maria issued the warning to Frank's mother. Maria would have her son killed. Former homicide detective Rod Demery suspects that at the time, no one in Columbia County was too concerned by Maria Sunnuti Spencer's brash words.
I think in hindsight, obviously people wish they had taken these threats more seriously. But the reality, during that particular time, people were listening and dismissing and probably chalking it up to what they did. Oh, she's a black widow, but not really thinking that it would actually happen.
In early 2009, Maria gained a powerful ally in her battles with Frank, her father.
Rocco Franklin was eventually paroled from state prison in 2009. He relocated to a town about 70 miles away from where Maria and Frank lived in Columbia County. It was Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which is the capital of Pennsylvania. When Rocco was paroled, a number of threats and a number of interactions between Maria and Frank took place, namely Maria suggesting that her father Rocco would cause him harm or hurt him if there were any further domestic disputes between Maria and Frank.
Arguments over access to the children, the family home, or Frank seeing other women were commonplace, and court documents reveal the fear that Frank felt of Maria and her now-released father. Police recorded that the victim was absolutely in fear to the point where he was changing his habits so he wouldn't be going to the bank on the same day. On an occasion, Rocco took offense at something Frank had said. Rocco and Maria demanded an apology.
I was surprised to find that my father wanted an apology. It wasn't a little thing, not a little joke. He's an old man. He's got funny ways. Just wants you to say sorry, and I got nothing to do with it.
It appeared from Frank's interaction with his friends that he was very concerned about Rocco Franklin being paroled from prison and being out and available perhaps to injure Frank or cause him harm or confront him over the difficulties he was having with Maria.
I thought I'd let you know because I care about you, because I wanted you back, not because I wanted to frighten you. Anything. I just wanted you to know that he wanted an apology. If you want to be stubborn about it, that's on you. Take care, Frank. End of message.
Frank was afraid, deathly afraid of Rocco. Maria, on the other hand, was pretty proud that it was her father. I think that gave her a sense of power.
There were threats and counter-threats, blazing rows, but also passionate reconciliations. Until, that is, Frank met someone new. The dysfunctional relationship was about to hit an all-time low, and Maria Sunnuti Spencer's homicidal potential was about to be unleashed.
Frank started dating a woman named Julie Dent very seriously, and I believe that really drove them apart and drove them to getting the final divorce decree in 2012.
When Frank met his new woman, Julie Dent, Maria became really angry, probably for a sense of loss of control or reality actually sitting in that they were truly getting divorced. She would leave threatening messages and tell Julie, you don't really think he loves you, or things to kind of shake her in the relationship.
Text messages from Maria to Judy were full on.
When she antagonized Frank's lover, she was essentially showing her dominance over her, that if you decide to carry on with my husband, I still own him and I will own you too. And this is all to be expected. This is par for the course for somebody like Maria. She wanted to make sure that this woman knew that she was still the alpha and she was watching everything, and that the only reason that she hadn't been hurt so far or even is able to keep her life at this moment is because Maria is allowing her to live and allowing her to carry on an affair with her husband.
Naturally, once Frank began to date Julie Dent, she would often encounter the kids. Frank would have custody of the children. Julie would spend time with the children and Frank. That was something that naturally bothered Maria and caused a lot of problems between the parties.
Hey, Julie, it's Maria Spencer. Do me a favor. Don't watch my children. Do not get between me and Frank by doing my children. Do you understand me?
Maria saw her family members, including Frank and her own children, as possessions. She owns them. And that's why she threatened Frank's lover using her children, essentially saying, you will not watch my children. You will have nothing to do with them. Because really for her, it's all about power and dominance. And she was essentially asserting that she has power and dominance over everybody, including her own family members, and that these are not people you should interact with in any way.
It was on 31st October 2009, Halloween, the harassment by Maria and her father turned into more tangible criminal acts.
The first property crime involved a breaking and entering into Frank's mother's property where the junkyard was housed.
What's odd is that the only thing that's taken are business records that, could prove how much Frank actually is making, but nothing else is taken.
It was always believed that those financial documents related to custody and support issues that were being played out in court in 2009 and 2010.
Strangely, the documents that were stolen from Frank's business showed up at Maria's doorstep. They only benefited Maria.
The records were potential ammunition for Maria and the Spencers' acrimonious divorce, and she made little secret of the fact that they'd been stolen for her benefit. Shaken but undeterred, Frank continued dating Julie Dent.
They are madly in love, and they don't want this to ruin that. They even booked this romantic Caribbean vacation.
Maria wasn't going to allow that to happen.
The night before they're to leave on their vacation, Maria calls Frank and she says, really, I need to talk to you about something.
Maria invited Frank, ironically, to a hotel in a neighboring town on the night of January 23rd of 2010. On that night, Maria invited Frank to dinner and then to stay overnight in the hotel.
She sent a message to the new woman in Frank's life too. Her reasons for spending the night with Frank became clear the following morning, so she could text Julie about who Frank really loved.
When Frank returned to his home on the morning of the 24th, he found a number of fire trucks, the fire marshal, and local police surrounding his burned-out building.
A court record shows that it was Maria. She later admitted it. But immediately after the arson attack, Maria appeared to get away with it.
Maria actually drove up to the scene of this crime, smiling and essentially almost looking like she was proud or boasting. This is clearly behavior that was not only taunting Frank and his family, but also showing them that she is not afraid of police. Clearly, they were also there at the scene. And she didn't care if people would actually associate her with this or not, because she still believed in many ways that she would be above the law.
It was believed and argued by the Commonwealth that Maria engineered that fire using Rocco Franklin to set the fire and destroy the property while she was away with Frank Spencer in a hotel in a neighboring town the night before.
Maria sends Frank these taunting messages. One of them is karma is just a wonderful thing. I mean, since you've just torn our life apart, your life just went up in flames. It seems fair, doesn't it?
The theory in court, of course, was that Maria was paying Frank back for taking a vacation with Julie in January of 2010, and as a consequence, the home was burned to the ground.
The fire is determined to be an arson, but there's just not evidence to show who's behind it, so it remains unsolved.
I think she really wanted to make sure that Frank and his family remained afraid and threatened.
How far would Maria Sanuti Spencer go in her feud with her husband and his new girlfriend?
You keep with me, because I'm not with you. I mean, it's been done. You didn't get the last message?
I think that Maria actually probably felt a high every time she got away with a threat, a type of crime where she wasn't arrested. I think that it also caused her to reach even higher next time. To get the next high, she'd have to outdo herself, to be even more severe, even more calculating, even more violent. And I think that there was a growing addiction to that feeling of power, being drunk on that feeling of absolute terror. I think that she really enjoyed exacting that on anybody around her.
An enjoyable, escalating addiction to violence that would end in murder. The arson attack in the recent past, it was Julie Dent's turn to be threatened.
Julie was confronted by Maria at a game, and Maria told her, "Your house is next."
Then more vitriolic text messages.
You better watch your Julie. You know, her life is about to take some dangerous turns too. She's going to lose her job. She's going to lose you. She's going to lose everything. So she's constantly threatening this couple. She's trying to break them apart. And she's really angry.
Later that summer, Maria struck again.
Maria is certainly escalating over time. Now she's not only threatening to enact property destruction, she's now threatening to ruin Frank's life and to ruin Frank's lover Julie's life, and to essentially make them break up and to lose each other as well. Anything that was in her arsenal to make the person personally afraid and to feel like their life wasn't worth living anymore, she was not going to shy away from. And I do believe that this is huge signs for what's to come, because Maria was essentially made for murder. She probably witnessed her father murdering and covering it up, and she had no problem taking it to that extreme. And I think she really did want Frank and Julie to be afraid for their lives at this point.
In August of 2010, another vacation had been planned with Julie and Frank. On August 25 of 2010, while Julie Dent was asleep in her home by herself, her home was set on fire. Side window was smashed out. Fluid was placed into the home and ignited by a road flare, and the home suffered significant fire damage. Julie, thankfully, was able to get out of the home, escaped off of a roof, and was able to escape without being harmed. Nevertheless, her home was completely destroyed by the fire.
When investigators are investigating arson, they look for a point of origin to find out where the fire actually started and kind of build a theory from there. They want to find out if there were accelerants used or any other materials to get the fire to start.
A jack belonging to a Nissan vehicle once owned by Mr. Rocco Franklin was found at the scene, believed to have been used to pry open a window to allow the accelerant to be put into the homes to set the house on fire.
A car jack, a plastic jug, partially used flare.
A lot of physical evidence pointed to Rocco Franklin for the firebombing of Julie Dent's home on August 25th of 2010. Folks that responded to the fire saw a Corvette speeding away from the scene. Rocco Franklin owned a Corvette at the time.
Maria is somebody who would stop at nothing to enact whatever justice she believed was deserving. And if she felt like she was wronged in any way, even if it's some small way, she will take it to the very extreme to make sure that you feel punished, to take away everything that means something to you, and to make you afraid for the rest of your life, not knowing when she was going to strike. And Maria certainly showed these patterns with Frank and Julie.
Nobody stood trial for the arson attack, and almost 2 years after Julie Dent's home was destroyed, Frank and Maria's divorce was finalized.
The parties were actually, by law, divorced on June 8 of 2012, which becomes an important date in the case.
The divorce decree assigned ownership of the family home on Fairview Drive, Selingsgrove, to Frank. Frank told friends that he still didn't feel safe.
A number of them had been confided in by Frank in the days and weeks leading up to his death, wherein he indicated that he felt his days were numbered, that Maria and her father had something planned for him, and he had become very scared.
The threats were graphic.
Maria wanted Frank not only to be afraid for his life, but to know that she would torture him for as long as she could, and essentially made him afraid for not only his life, but also what would happen even if he was alive, that he would essentially live this terrible life without the love of his children.
On June 27th, Frank wrote to Maria asking her to stay away from the house. 3 days later, the termination of the Spencer marriage was published in the local paper. Later that same day, Frank and Maria had a very public run-in.
He had attended a baseball game for his young son, who was about 10 to 12 years of age at the time, and played in the local Little League. That evening, Maria likewise attended the game, and Frank was seen harassing Maria at the game. The witnesses that testified for the government at trial corroborated that and said that Frank was joking with her and being difficult. Maria was a diabetic and a very brittle diabetic at the time, had lots of neuropathy, difficulty walking, and things of that sort. And all of the accounts of Frank's friends who testified at trial suggested that Frank was mocking her publicly and, kind of embarrassing her about her limitations.
Mockery of a mafia man's daughter? Not a good idea, because soon after, Frank Spencer was dead.
That all occurred on the evening of June 30, 2012. It is believed from the forensic evidence that he was killed about 12 hours later on the morning of July 1, 2012.
It would be 2 days before the crime was discovered. On July 3rd, friends who hadn't heard from Frank since the baseball game went to his home in Selingsgrove to investigate.
When Frank was found, he was found in the doorway of his home in a pool of blood. His arms were stretched out above his head, and it appeared that he had been dragged.
The police noted prominently a gunshot wound to his head.
The second shot was a closer shot through the bicep and into the chest cavity.
The fact that the second shot was fired at close range when most likely the first shot already incapacitated Frank and killed him shows that this was a personal issue. This is not just somebody who wanted the person to feel the least pain possible as they were being murdered. This is somebody who really wanted to look at their victim up close, to see them suffering, to see what they look like when they were dead.
Frank's friends were in little doubt who'd murdered him, Maria and her father. But detectives needed evidence to prove it.
Immediately on inspection of a crime scene of a shooting, you're looking for blood spatter, where the blood may have landed. You're looking for projectiles that may have come from a bullet that's entered the body or may still be in the body. You're looking for shell casings, and you're looking for the angle or the trajectory for where the bullet may have went in. Also, the velocity of blood spatter, how fine the mist is on the wall, or there are a lot of different things that make a shooting different from any other murder.
The blood evidence certainly told a story.
Frank is found dead on the front porch of his home. He's lying in a pool of blood, and it looks as though the blood has been pushed with a broom or something.
That would indicate that someone attempted to clean up the blood or wipe the blood.
Investigators take a piece of the tile floor, and they are able to lift from that a bloody footprint, and it matches to a size 11 Dr. Scholl's escape model sneaker, the same kind of shoe that Maria's father Rocco is known to have worn.
But what about his daughter Maria? Could it be proved she was at the scene?
Finally, they found a rubber glove located inside the home. This was a glove that would be typically worn by an individual that was cleaning a toilet or a sink or using some kind of industrial cleaner in their home. That glove ultimately had DNA belonging to Maria Spencer inside of it.
Investigators also noticed two absences from the scene: Frank's truck and his dog.
On the morning of July 1st, 2012, the police were able to gather video surveillance from local stores and businesses that operated along the highways that surrounded Frank Spencer's home. They were able to piece together Frank's coming and goings from the night before and the morning after the June 30th baseball game. They figured that the murder happened at about 8:30 in the morning on July 1 because they saw his Harley-Davidson pickup truck leaving along the highways adjacent to his home in and around the 9 a.m. Point in time.
The quality of the video wasn't sufficient enough to tell who was driving the vehicle, but one thing was clear is that someone was driving Frank's truck from the crime scene.
The vehicle was located in Sunbury Township, which is a township wherein Maria Spencer, her brother, owns a bar. The first piece of evidence found in that vehicle was Mr. Spencer's wallet, which was loaded with cash and credit cards. So the police eliminated robbery as a motive for his killing pretty quickly.
When the truck was found, there was no sign of Frank's dog.
As police continue their investigation, they get some help from an unlikely source. About an hour away from Frank's house, these two wedding planners are setting up for a wedding. And all of a sudden, this dog walks in, this Weimaraner, and he's happy and healthy and wagging his tail, and he's clearly somebody's dog. He's not a stray. And, the couple doesn't know what the deal is, but they report this dog, has just turned up at our place. As it turns out, this dog was Frank's dog, Muttley.
The dog was found near a catering facility about 10 miles away from the home of Rocco Franklin.
The wedding venue was on the North Susquehanna Trail at Dauphin, 40 miles south of Frank's home and just a few miles from Harrisburg, where Rocco had lived since his release from prison.
The police concluded pretty quickly that Mr. Franklin's activities included taking Mr. Spencer's truck, loading the truck with Mr. Spencer's dog, going to the son's bar in Sunbury, and then making his way back to his home, where the dog was left unharmed at a catering facility and later recovered that day.
As detectives were building a timeline of events around Frank Spencer's death, he was on the mortuary slab in Bloomsburg. What the coroner found would paint an even more intriguing picture as to how Mr. Spencer had died.
As investigators determined that the first shot was from a rifle and possibly a longer distance, they expanded the crime scene. They went into the woods.
Detectives were closing in on a former mobman and his daughter, a woman, it seemed, made for murder. Both Rocco Franklin and his daughter Maria were heavily implicated in the death of Frank Spencer, but both were still free, evidence still being gathered.
Investigators determined that Frank had actually been shot by two guns. One was a rifle shot at a long distance. The other was a close-up shot, and that would indicate something more personal.
When it's discovered that a shot may have come from a rifle or a long-range weapon, we're going to try to determine where that shot was fired from.
They searched the area, and it's at this point of the year, it's summertime, so the woods are all leafed out, and it would be easy for someone to hide out in the woods.
They went into the woods, and they found a tree that was Y-shaped, perfect for steadying a rifle for a shot.
A tree stand was set up in a tree about 150 feet up a hill directly across the street from Frank Spencer's home.
They search this area where this tree is, and they find a spent bullet casing, and then they also find a soft case for a rifle there.
They believe the first shot came from Rocco Franklin, who was perched across the street in the tree stand, having used a long gun or a rifle to shoot the first shot that they believe went through Mr. Spencer's neck.
And then someone got closer to Frank as he lay on the ground.
They think, and have argued at trial, that a second shot occurred after Frank dropped at the front door after the first shot made contact with him. They believe that second shot came from a handgun. They recovered a bullet from the body of Mr. Spencer. So they believe there were two shots. They believe the second shot was discharged from a handgun at close range and actually killed Frank Spencer.
Detectives could not prove who had fired the shots. Forensic evidence placed Maria and her father at the scene, but it did not prove that they had fired the weapons.
A couple of months go by, and when police are trying to get them to talk, they call Maria in for questioning, and she refuses. They call Rocco in, and he's, okay. So he goes in and he agrees to talk to investigators, and they ask him, where were you on the day of? And Rocco is, he loves this kind of cat and mouse game.
During that interview, Rocco said that he had not left his home in Harrisburg.
Detectives knew differently.
The cell phone contacts that Mr. Franklin had showed him at or near the catering location in Harrisburg where the dog was found. They also located him in and around the Sunbury Township area where the F-150 had been found.
Questioned about the presence of his DNA and fingerprints at the crime scene and on Frank's truck, Rocco Franklin told a fantastical story.
They say, we know you were at Frank's house. Oh, that's right. I forgot. I went to Frank's that day to clean. I was doing some laundry, and I used a push broom to sweep the floors.
He said that at one point he wanted to test drive Frank's truck and purchase it. And Frank's response to him was, "I'll wrestle you for it."
So obviously you can see that he's trying to put together a reason why his DNA would show up at the scene. And he's enjoying every minute of it.
Circumstantial evidence mounting in August 2013, 13 months after Frank's murder, prosecutors convened a grand jury to determine if there was enough evidence to charge Maria Sanuti Spencer and her father, Rocco Franklin.
In the months leading up to the indictment of Maria and Rocco were asked to come to testify before the investigating grand jury in Pennsylvania. Ultimately, she went before that grand jury, as did Rocco, and gave statements that were obviously under oath.
Maria, in her testimony, just goes on and on and on. She barely stops talking. She denies, of course, everything. She denies terroristic threats and everything else. But the authorities have the evidence. And so they filed charges on her. They filed charges of 12 counts of perjury, more than a dozen other charges, and most importantly, the murder of Frank Spencer.
In a process fraught with delays, Maria was not arrested until July 28, 2014, 2 years after Frank's death.
Detectives go to arrest Maria, and she freaks out. On the same day, authorities also issue a warrant for Rocco's arrest, but he is nowhere to be found. He has flown the coop.
Shortly after the grand jury testimony was taken, Rocco Franklin disappeared from the United States. Nobody knows how he got there, but he ended up living in Argentina. Ultimately, he was located, he was detained, and he fought extradition. During the time that he was fighting extradition, the trial of Maria Spencer commenced.
It was November 2015 when Maria stood alone in the dock to answer for Frank's death.
Motive was the government's biggest piece of evidence. They had piles of text messages, piles of police criminal reports, piles of circumstantial evidence of her involvement in property crime. She had the motive, she had the anger.
I'm not with you. I need it, Spencer. I'm done. You didn't get the last message?
She had the ability, with her father having been out on parole, and that she was the driving force to get her father behind the property crimes, the arsons, and ultimately his murder.
You don't win unless I let you in. Do you understand? You don't win, Spencer.
One of the more prominent statements attributed to Maria took place at a football game shortly after Frank Spencer's murder, where she allegedly said to one of his friends that she was responsible for the murder and that he might be next if he steps out of line with Maria and Rocco.
One of Frank's friends comes up to Maria, just wants to be safe, and he says, Maria, I would never do anything to, in front of your kids. I would never do anything to disrespect you. And she looks at him and she says, that's why you're still alive. But then she goes on and she says, the last thing he saw before he died was me.
Maria clearly decided that she was going to continue to terrorize everybody that Frank was associated with, even after his death. And in some ways, she was even gloating about the fact that she was responsible for his death, saying to his friends that she was the last thing or the last person that Frank saw right before he died. And I think that she wanted to maintain that control and dominance over everybody in that social circle. She wanted to let them know that if any of them stepped out of line, they could end up just like Frank.
The outburst was more evidence placing Maria firmly at the scene of Frank's death, and may even have proved that she fired the bullet that killed him.
The government argued that Maria was the perpetrator of the second fatal shot. In other words, She was the first individual onto the decking after Mr. Spencer was shot by Mr. Franklin from the tree stand across the street, and that she approached Mr. Spencer as he lied in blood outside his front door on the porch deck and administered, so to speak, the kill shot with a small handgun.
Maria and her lawyers refuted this version of events.
Lots of physical evidence, electronic data-based evidence, suggested that Mr. Franklin was the sole perpetrator of the crime. We still believe that, and we still think that Maria didn't have the physical or mental capacity to do what they claim she did.
On November 18th, 2015, the jury retired to consider its verdict.
A jury and jury deliberations are always nail-biters because they're humans, and no two humans are alike. So you can have a room of 12 people, and 10 could be thinking the same thing, but the other two don't.
After 8 hours of deliberation, the jury comes back. Maria Spencer is found guilty on all charges: the murder of Frank Spencer, 12 counts of perjury, arson, conspiracy, terroristic threats. They sentence her to life without parole plus 50 years.
In Pennsylvania, if you're convicted of first-degree murder, the only sentence you can get is a mandatory life sentence. She received additional time for some of the additional offenses. She's currently housed in a state correctional facility in Pennsylvania and will be for the rest of her life in the event that her appeals are unsuccessful.
I believe that because Maria had escaped the law for so long and that she had a long history of escalating from domestic violence to threats on Frank and Frank's lover's life to setting a fire, burning a house down, and then finally to the murder itself, it was always going to escalate more and more as she got away with more, because there was a thrill in getting away with the things that she did. And the more that she got away with, the more she became emboldened to take the next step.
In October 2018, after a lengthy extradition process, Maria's father returned to face justice.
2 years later, her father, Rocco, goes on trial, and he too is found guilty. He's guilty of Frank's murder, arson, and burglary. The jury sentences him to life without parole plus 45 years.
He had been a man of the mafia and had helped raise a daughter who appeared predestined to kill.
When we look at people who grow up with possible psychopathic links or traits, we think about it as a combination of both biological influences as well as environmental influences. And in this case, Maria really had both, because her father was a well-known criminal, a mobster, and I believe that she looked at the way he solved problems and took a lot from them as she grew up and decided that this was going to be the way that she would get through her life and make people fearful of her and get what she wants.
And what she wanted was to see her husband dead at her hands. A woman made for murder. Donald Miller claims the lives of 4 and tried to kill 2 others.
This is a person who is able to carry out really gruesome acts, and it just seems like it's another day for Don Miller.
At that point, he reached around me and put a knife right to my neck and said, "Be quiet."
He started cutting my neck. He started slicing my throat.
I heard my brother scream.
Donald Miller, saint in the church where he was a regular, but a sinner made for murder. In newly unearthed decades-old recordings digitally remastered for this program, Don Miller can be heard revealing something of himself.
You can't judge a book by
So what sort of cover did Don Miller put on show?
My first impression of him was a nice, clean-cut guy.
A devout Christian, too.
One of the people that knew me best, chapter 4.
Don grew up in a very religious household.
Judy Ho is a forensic psychologist who unpacks the life and crimes of killers to reveal what makes them murder.
Don's early life was likely greatly controlled. There were certain things that he was allowed to do and not allowed to do, and what was considered proper and what was good and what was bad. And in some ways, when individuals are raised that way, they may have a more difficult time staying in the lines as they grow up. There's going to be an internal sense to want to rebel in some way.
It's sad. I'm so crying.
The Don Miller serial killer story is still being updated as he seeks parole, but it began 40 years ago.
Back in 1978, these missing women were coming up in the Lansing area. There was a genuine concern and a palpable fear in the mid-Michigan area, especially around the Michigan State University campus.
These women just absolutely disappeared. So the thought was, how many more are going to disappear, and is this a serial killer? The women were scared. They didn't want to go out. They almost thought, who's going to be next? I don't want to be the next one.
Don Miller met his first victim at church, where college student Martha Sue Young was a regular. It is where Miller told friends he'd found his soulmate.
Don basically fell in love. They spent a lot of time together, but most of the time when they went out, it was to prayer meetings, things like that. They didn't go to movies, they didn't go dancing or anything like that.
Martha was in trouble.
Don Miller was sexually repressed, I would say. He had an intense hatred for women.
An entrance in a friend's yearbook reveals the disturbing train of Miller's thoughts when it came to women. The prime directive is to kill and not to let those chicks ruin your morals, he wrote. Despite this early evidence of misogyny, Miller proposed to Martha. 2 weeks after accepting his proposal, she called it off. Rejection would prove fatal.
Martha wanted to break up with him. Martha did not seem like, towards the end of the relationship, was very happy with him.
He told her that she could keep the engagement ring because they were still friends. And so on New Year's Eve of 1976, Martha had a babysitting job that she had to do. And Don asked if he could go along with her. And they did. They went babysat. They went back to Don's house. Don lived with his parents in East Lansing, and when they got back to the house, they watched a movie. They had some pizza and pop, and then at about 11:30, Don left with Martha to take her home, and Martha never made it home.
January 1st, 1977. Martha Sue Young's mother, Sue, did not find her daughter at home. She knew she'd been out with Miller.
Sue Young woke up on New Year's Day, 1977, and went to Martha's bedroom and saw that her bed had not been slept in. And she panicked. She contacted the Miller family immediately.
The Millers rang the police. Then a young officer, Ken Ouellette, took the call.
And on the other end, there was an individual. Ken, this is Gene Miller. I said, hi, Gene, because I had known him from before. And I said, what's going on? He goes, Martha's gone. And I had no idea who Martha was at that time. And I said, well, who's Martha? And he goes, well, Donnie's girlfriend. She had just apparently disappeared. We realized that something just wasn't right. It was kind of a gut feeling.
Investigators that he was an innocent.
He was very calm, very willing to help. He was not evasive in any way. He never said the word no as far as cooperation. In fact, he was quite the opposite. I'll never forget it. It's like, Don, do you want to get something to eat? Do you want to get something to drink? And he'd say, oh, no. He says, I just want to find Martha. I just want to help you find Martha. And of course, later I found that when I interrogated him and interviewed him, he had murdered his girlfriend, some 6 or 7 hours before that.
Despite the failed polygraph test, Miller was not considered a suspect.
Don was clearly a very calculated criminal, and there were so many things that he appeared to just not be rattled by that obviously most average people would clearly be in a fight or flight response. They wouldn't be thinking clearly, and yet he doesn't even seem like his pulse was raised in this situation. He had a story for everything. He was calm, and it just seems like this is just another day for him.
Investigators searched Miller's car. That would yield more evidence, and also more of Miller's shrewd excuses.
There was what appeared to be a mild blood stain in the middle of the front seat. So that was certainly concerning. And then on the right side, the passenger side door panel on the inside, I could see it looked like maybe a foot had scraped itself across the door.
He first said that he might have had a bloody nose, but he eventually changed his story and said that the blood could have been caused by Martha Sue menstruating when they were out and about, because they had engaged in some foreplay, and if she was menstruating, that could have caused the blood to be there.
Ouellette may have been suspicious, but he and the team of detectives were missing a crucial piece of evidence. Any proof that Martha was actually dead.
I went up in a helicopter and we searched an area, and there was absolutely no doubt in my mind that the areas that we searched, she was not at. There was no doubt because of the recent snow. I mean, we could see animal tracks, we could see car tracks, and there was absolutely no doubt that had she been in that area, we would have located her. If we would have just expanded the search another couple miles, literally, no doubt in my mind, we would have found her clothes and we would have found her body.
But detectives did not find her body, so Donald Miller remained free.
Don Miller certainly believed that he got away with murder. And that became evident as time went on when he began taking more chances. There's no doubt in my mind.
This is what Miller had done.
Don Miller never took Martha Sue home. They went out, and by his own account, they tried talking, but she refused to talk about their problems, and so he ended up strangling her. And at that point, he had to do something with the body. And so he took her body about a mile or two away, maybe 3 miles, to a park and left her body there.
3 months later, Martha's mother received a bouquet of flowers. The bouquet read, "Martha was a rose." It was signed Don Miller.
When he sent flowers to Martha's mom and essentially referred to his ex Martha as a rose, he was clearly trying to rattle her mother. And he was clearly trying to show her who was boss, and essentially that he is still in control, and that even though he was a person of interest, that he could get away with anything that he wanted to do, including taunting her about her daughter's death.
Don Miller, the church-going model boyfriend, had killed his first victim. Her body still undiscovered, so Miller was free to kill again. "17 months after Martha Sue Young went missing, another woman disappeared, Marita Choquette. Her father, a minister of a church, raised the alarm.
Marita Choquette was an employee at Michigan State University. She was working at WKAR, the public broadcasting radio station on campus, and she actually lived in a small town called Grand Ledge. And when she didn't show up for work, her father called the Grand Ledge Police Department and asked them to check her apartment, see if she was there. And they began the initial missing person investigation.
Don Miller lived a 10-minute drive from the university radio station, and he knew Marita. Again, the church played a role in events. The couple had met there, a place where people would recognize Miller's devotion to his God, he thought.
They would have very high regard for my morals.
Was the moral stance Miller referred to in his 1993 audio interview what motivated him to kill Marita Choquette?
Marita was known to have had extramarital sexual relations with people after her divorce.
2 weeks after disappearing, the body of Marita Choquette was found buried under concrete slabs. It was a crime scene laden with religious iconography, the theme of Miller's murderous life.
It was almost as if Marita's body was placed in a form that was a ritualistic sacrifice, that perhaps she is going to be the person who pays for her own sins and also the sins of others.
She was partially nude. She had been stabbed 19 times, and her hands were also cut off, and they were placed under some rocks or another concrete slab near her body. They were literally in sort of a praying position, if you will, like this.
Don really felt like he was the person who could be the judge of all of this and should be the person to carry these acts out, almost as if he was helping to do justice and helping to right good and try to prune the world from the wrongs of society and the immorality that he saw in Marita.
Back at MSU, where Miller studied criminology, and on the same day that Marita's body was found, university employee Wendy Bush had just finished her shift at the college cafeteria. She was met by a handsome stranger. He offers her a ride home. His name? Don Miller.
I believe that Don felt like women were the weak link, that women were the root of evil, and it probably does trace back to the fact that his first I think he wanted Martha to be this person who was obedient to him, who would be forever devoted to him, and that certainly was not how she acted.
Once he took the life of his fiancée, he continued that as he described it, as copycat murders. He would see a woman that reminded him of his fiancée, and he would take her life.
Wendy Bush had met Don Miller. Her personality had made it easy for Miller to strike up a conversation.
Wendy Bush was sort of a free spirit on campus. She could talk to anybody. She didn't show up for work one day, and that was actually the day that Marita Choquette's body was found. And so her supervisor called the Michigan State University Police, and they took a missing person report, and they began to check into her disappearance. They were not convinced that there was any foul play because of Wendy's personality. They thought she might have just left campus. The interesting thing about Wendy Bush's disappearance is that she was epileptic, and she didn't take her medication or any of her belongings from her dorm. So while they were convinced that she was a missing person, they weren't sure that it was related to any type of foul play.
I believe Don had long-range plans to continue his killings for as long as he could. He was essentially gearing up to be a career criminal if he was never caught.
His third victim, Wendy Bush, had been missing without her body being discovered for weeks when another woman disappeared, Kristen Stewart. Police officer Denise Keener Barnes was in her first year as a cop in 1977.
I was working patrol in Delta Township, and I heard about the Christine Stewart missing person. And that's all we knew at the time was the missing person.
Christine Stewart was a teacher at Lansing's Everett High School. She lived nearby with her husband. On the day that she disappeared, she was due to take a car in for repairs and return from the garage by bus. She never returned home. Miller had spotted her walking along the sidewalk. He would say later that he thought it was the pointed the car at Kristen.
We can really see Don's obsessiveness as he envisioned a second person to be his first victim, Martha, again. And in a fit of rage, he ran over her with his car. And I think that comes from a place of an obsessive mind where he's thinking about all the wrongs that Martha had put on him when essentially she rejected him. And it was almost like killing Martha wasn't enough. He had to kill anybody else that would resemble Martha in any small way because he still hadn't worked through his anger and resentment towards his ex-girlfriend.
It changed the landscape of the Lansing area. Kids were no longer allowed to just go ride their bikes or walk around the neighborhoods. The parents were on high alert. People were on high alert. They had no idea how or why these women were coming up missing.
Enquiries did turn up a witness.
So this is the intersection of Wolf Court and Coolidge. And Christine Stewart was walking along Coolidge when she turned onto Fair Oaks. But the significance of Wolf Court is there was a witness who had just left her home at this intersection. And she turned onto Coolidge and drove northbound. And when she reached Fair Oaks, a car turned in front of her, so she had to lock up her brakes. And she looked over and she saw a man and a woman arguing. And then she saw the man thrust a knife 3 times into the woman as they wrestled inside the car. And as it turns out, it was Don Miller murdering Christine Stewart.
Miller had claimed his 4th victim. He let 2 days go by before attacking again, this time at the home of Lisa and Randy, an attack which saw Randy and Lisa Gilbert narrowly escape, becoming victims 5 and 6.
The attack on Lisa was relatively days after he disposed of Christine Stewart's body in Delta Township. And I believe that him passing by and seeing Lisa Gilbert out in front or coming around the corner, he took the opportunity. The opportunity was there.
If Randy had not come home that day, Lisa became victim number 5.
Hometown spot.
Yep, the hometown spot. I do miss it. I really do.
Today, they live 3,000 miles apart and seldom see each other. But for this program, they got together to help keep the profile of Don Miller high. Lisa was 14 years old when he walked into her home.
I was getting ready to prepare to call my stepmom. My brother Randy went out back fishing in the pond.
That day, I was out doing my thing, and something just told me, go home. It's time to go home.
I went outside the garage door and went around out the garage and around the house to call Randy. And then when I came back around the house to go inside to wait for him to get there, there was a car in the driveway. And there, when I walked through the garage, a gentleman was coming out of our back door, out of the kitchen area. And I said, can I help you? Because I thought at that time that it could have been somebody coming in to repair, because it was a freshly new home and we still had things wrong. So I didn't think anything of a person being there. And he says, yeah, he says, I was wondering, is your dad home? And I'm like, no, he's at work. And he's like, can I get a phone number to get a hold of him? I'm thinking, okay, it has to do with something in repairing for the home. He didn't look like he was a mean person. So I said, yes, just a minute. And I went back in to the house and proceeded to try to get a paper and pencil when I did not know he was behind me. Or came in behind me. And then at that point, he reached around me and put a knife right to my neck and said, be quiet, and then you won't get hurt. And then he proceeded to walk me into my parents' bedroom, which was on the same floor, and proceeded to take all my clothes off and rape me. He also proceeded to take the belt from my shorts and choked me, and that belt broke. And then after that, he was using his hands and trying to choke me. I got to the point where I was blacked out and starting to see stars. and then my brother walked in.
He grabbed me and from behind, and he put a knife to my throat. He said, "Just be quiet. I'm not going to hurt you. Where's your bedroom?" I said, "My bedroom's upstairs." Still with a knife to my throat, still holding me. We walked up the stairs. We stepped into my bedroom, and he put me down on the floor, face first, and he sat on my back, but I had one arm behind my back. It would have been my left arm. And at that point, he started cutting my neck. He started slicing my throat. And of course, here's where the struggle starts. Here's where I got to do something here, I got to fight back.
I heard my brother scream, so at this time, I did not know where he was, what he was doing.
I thought I would play dead, get him to run away, because I thought he was going to kill me.
Lisa, meanwhile, had managed to release herself. He tied her up.
I unlocked the front door with my hands behind my back and then just run out in the street with no clothes on, blood coming from my nose, my hands still tied, and a tight neck thing around my neck.
Having stabbed her brother Randy in the neck and chest and strangled him till he lost consciousness, Miller left him for dead.
The stab wounds, I took 2 to the chest. One had punctured a lung, and the doctors say that the other stab wound actually was close enough to my heart that it barely scratched it.
Miller simply departed the bloody scene.
When he walked outside, he was cool, calm, and collected. This is the type of individual that had no thought or concern with what he was doing other than to accomplish whatever desire he had inside of him.
He doesn't really let his emotions run away with him. And for him, everything is dictated in advance. And he probably also spent a lot of time fantasizing about it in advance, thinking about how it's going to feel when he's able to actually carry out these acts that he planned.
He casually walked out of Randy and Lisa's house, spoke to the first individual who showed up, who had just seen Lisa running down the street, naked and gagged, or with the belt still around her neck, and he acted like nothing had happened.
Upstairs was my bedroom and Lisa's bedroom and a full bath. And in that bathroom, we had a telephone. I remember going for that, and I picked up, nothing was there. Remember trying to dial, I think back then, just 00 to anything. I probably was hitting a million buttons, I don't know, but I was getting nothing. So I thought, I gotta get out of here. I ran down the stairs, right to the front door, and I opened up the door, and I saw another guy. And he's like, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" And then another guy come around the corner, and I knew that guy. And that was the fire chief, Kenny Dorn. And I looked down, and I could see blood just gushing from my chest. At that moment is when I also saw the corner of my eye, Don Miller leaving in his car, and he drove around that big rock. It wasn't there at the time. The driveway was still designed that way. And he drove across the lawn and came out through the ditch and headed that way.
I got a call to assist the Delta Township Fire Department on an unknown trouble call. So I immediately turned my car around and started heading towards the response on Canal Road, and got another call from the dispatch, asked how soon I would be able to get there. And I said, should be about a minute. Their response was, well, step on it. And that sent up a flag to me that there was something going on there that was more than just the routine. It was absolute chaos when I arrived. I pulled up on the scene. There was a man walking in a circular motion in the driveway. Saw 2 or 3 vehicles in the roadway, one of which was the fire chief's car. The chief, he said, I want you to look at this young lady's, the way her hands were bound and the necktie around her neck. And I did. I could see that she had been assaulted. Her face was a beet red color, much more so than should be, as if someone had probably tried to strangle her. I didn't know at that time. She was only clad in a necktie, and her eyes were bloodshot to the extreme. And her hands were still bound with what appeared to be perhaps nylon stockings.
I was just upset, very upset, and just like freaking out. And he's like, my brother's dying, I
could see Randy Gilbert, who was one of the victims, laying half in and half out of the front doorway of the residence, bleeding profusely. I was fearful that he might not live very long. His upper body was covered with blood.
And then finally they put him in the ambulance, and he's like, "Sister, I'm okay. I'm okay." And then I just kind of relieved, and we both went to the hospital. What I think if my brother didn't come home is I wouldn't be here right now. Randy and I we have a bond, a special bond.
I tried my best to put it into words, but it's more horrific than I can ever explain. And like I said, there doesn't a day go by. I've got physical scars. I see them every single day. I got memories that come back every single day. There's can't shut it off.
He takes it hard. He used to keep it bottled up inside him.
So we secured the scene, and at that point in time, I passed the gentleman who I later learned was Mr. Reagan. He was walking in a circle repeating this license plate number. So I quickly copied that down from him. I went back to my patrol car and ran the license plate number on the vehicle. The registration came back to a Donald G. Miller out of East Lansing. And I thanked the dispatcher for the information. At that time, the dispatcher came on. He said, "Do you realize who you're dealing with there?" I think that was the words he used. I said, "No." And he said, "Martha Sue Young case." Immediately, a light went off in my head because I knew that Donald Miller had, in fact, been a suspect in her disappearance.
And as soon as that information was sent via radio to all of the police agencies in the mid-Michigan area, the East Lansing police already knew where Miller lived and where his new fiancée lived. And so they set up a stakeout basically on those locations, and Don Miller was arrested 2 hours after he raped Lisa Gilbert.
It really didn't surprise anybody, and it was like we finally got him.
Oh, well, they just had my license plate number and traced it down.
Donald Miller was found guilty of the rape and attempted murders of Lisa and Randy and was jailed for between 30 and 50 years. But what of the 4 dead and missing women? At first, he denied any knowledge of them. But police uncovered items linking Miller to the missing women, including the engagement ring that he gave to Martha Sue Young and a pair of handcuffs stained with blood.
He kept trophies, shrines, to essentially remember the crimes that he had committed or to study crimes that he wanted to commit. And I think that this was an indication of the wildness of his fantasy world in his mind. I think when he wasn't killing, he was planning them, fantasizing about them, and he was enjoying it. Oftentimes we see that with serial criminals. They really get a type of high, even just visualizing the killings, even if they're not doing it. And that is a part of their fascination with keeping these mementos.
It was only when these trophies were found that Miller asked for a deal. He offered to reveal the location of the bodies if he was allowed to plead guilty only to manslaughter and to 2 of the killings.
Four. Why didn't they find it? They just... Look in the wrong spots. Yeah. Just looking in the wrong spots.
Don Miller took a team of investigators and led them to Martha Sue Young's skeleton. This is where Martha Sue Young's body was found. This road leading back into the park back 40 years ago was basically just a two-track trail. They were walking along. He was sort of leading the way, and they passed an animal trail off to the side in this park, and he just continued walking straight. He said, "She's down there," just nonchalantly. And then as investigators went wildflower and kind of began singing to himself.
And so he gave the victims back to their families after he had just left them, basically alone, dead in a park.
Wendy Bush's remains were skeletal. June, July, August, September, 2 months, and she was completely skeletonized when they found her. Kids were playing within 20 feet of her body and didn't even realize it.
In return for revealing where he had buried the bodies, prosecutors agreed to charge Miller with the manslaughter of 2 of the victims and not to charge him in relation to the other 2 women.
I think they all knew that Don Miller was the one responsible. And so, for them, it was a way to bring closure. For Don Miller, it was a way to manipulate the system. For him to manage to commit 4 murders for 10 years. That was him using the knowledge that he had. And to be honest, I'm sure at that time that they thought 30 to 50 years seemed like forever. And for a lot of the attorneys that were involved in that case, they're now retired. So for them, it was forever. Randy and Lisa were 13 and 14. So for them, 40 years later isn't really forever. And that's where we come to today.
Don Miller advocated for understanding and a potential release one day from the very start of the investigation against him. And he has carried on with his efforts. Years after first denying he had killed Martha Sue Young, Miller accepted in a letter from his prison cell that he did wrongfully take her life. But he says he was the one who had been in pain.
Don was already looking forward to the time where he might actually get a second chance at life and be let out of incarceration. And as much as the police try to help the families build the case against him, he was essentially fighting back already, planning what he was going to say to try to get out of prison. And a big part of this were a series of writings where he talked a lot about repression, repressing his anger, repressing his resentment. Essentially, in that letter, he didn't take any responsibility for his behavior. Instead, he blamed other people, he blamed society, he blamed other individuals in his life for somehow ostracizing him and hurting him and trying to use that as his explanation for why he did what he did.
He gives excuses as to why he got to the way he was, that he victimizes the victims. He blames them for his crimes. He didn't actually do anything wrong. It was the victim who caused him to get to the point of anger to actually commit the crime.
In 1979, after he was sentenced, Don Miller, a serial killer, could look forward to a release date sometime around the year 2000. All he had to do was keep out of trouble in prison. It was in 1993 that he was interviewed as he tried to begin the process leading to his release.
For the most part, he had a pretty uneventful stay in prison, right? I mean, you haven't picked up a lot of tickets, haven't had a lot of problems or anything else. You had any problems with the other inmates or anything?
Well, this is probably, back in the 80s, some of the assault in the print shop.
After the interview in 1993, Miller was described as ready to explode. Despite that, there remained the very real possibility that he would one day be released, a prospect so chilling to Randy Gilbert that he began preparing.
The things I've had to do in my life to prepare myself for this is I got to protect my family. I got to teach my family to protect themselves. So I just want to send a message to Mr. Miller. If he ever thinks he's not finished and he thinks he's going to come after me again, he needs to know I'm prepared.
Don Miller's request for parole came because he had a realistic prospect of release. In the old technology reel-to-reel analog recordings, he can be heard arguing his case. His max, he says, that's maximum sentence, was coming up soon. Time to hire a lawyer and talk about being freed.
A couple of years before I even reached my max. So in that 2 years, I don't see why we can't just get the mutual time with you and me and my lawyer can get together and just have a social forum, talk about all this.
Do you want to talk about all this?
In his presence, sure.
But in 1994, a setback for Don Miller's plans to walk free from jail. He was caught with a strangulation device in his cell at Kinross Correctional Facility, Chippewa County.
The theory was that he was going to use that on one of the female prison officers that had, I think, written him a ticket in prison.
Miller's sentence was extended another 20 to 40 years.
He has already served his time for the deaths of Martha Sue Young and Christine Stewart in the rape and attempted murder of the Gilberts. He's already served that time. The only reason that he is still in prison is because he possessed that strangulation device and he got caught.
In 2021, Miller did indeed sit before a parole board. His application was rejected. Despite being refused parole in 2021, by 2031, the deal Miller got after his crimes means that there will be nothing to stop him from being released.
Do I know that this is an individual who should not be out on the streets? Yes, I do.
Do I think Don Miller should ever be released from prison? No. Absolutely not. Is it inevitable? Yes.
For the protection of our community, this is an individual who needs to stay in prison.
Don Miller will be released in 2031.
Growing up as a young teenager, I thought it felt like he was put away forever. Because the time that he got and all that, it seemed like forever. But that time's gone by. And he's still dangerous. He's still going to be dangerous in 10 years.
There's not enough help in this world to make him rehabilitated. He never will be. I am a survivor, and I can still survive, whether he's out or in, but I'm going to be scared, of course. I feel that he is not finished, that he will come looking.
With Miller locked up, the question remains, why had he done it? Killed 4 women, raped a 5th, tried to kill her and her brother. For Judy Ho, the clues for Miller's motivation are there for all to see. In his first murder, that of Martha, religion looms large in the Miller psyche.
Don certainly utilized a lot of religious themes in his killings, and Martha was a really good example of this. He essentially had all of her items laid out, and even the way that her body was positioned as if she had ascended to heaven. There were a lot of heaven and hell themes that were apparent.
When he was arrested, Don Miller hid behind his religion, behind his Christianity, if you will. He said, "How could it be me? There's no way it could be me. I'm a Christian. There's no way I would ever do this."
I believe that Don became very obsessed with the structure that he grew up with, and a big part of that was the religiosity of his family. And I think that he really saw the world in black and white. There were the good people and the bad people, and there's really no grays. And I think that type of obsessiveness and that type of devotion to this idea of black and whiteness of the world and the right and wrongs of the world is what probably led him down this path of killing in a way that links back to these spiritual or religious ideas. I think in some ways he was able to justify the heinous crimes that he committed by thinking that perhaps he was doing God's work in some very sick way. And I think that he felt like he had justification. If anybody ever asked, if anybody ever found out, he could say, well, these people were all people who deserved to die because they were bad people.
Prosecutor Doug Lloyd believes there's a simpler motivation. Miller simply enjoyed killing.
I believe that the first one potentially was one of just anger. The next three, those were a desire that he was fulfilling. I think in the first one, he felt the desires. And then when he capitalized on it, he realized, I really enjoy this.
Don Miller's sentence ends in 2031. If he reaches 77 years old, he will be released from prison. And on his release, at least one person is prepared, should Miller wish to attack again.
I will never seek out. I will never hunt down. I will never try to do anything unlawful. This is all the steps I need to take to feel safe, to feel, my family's protected. Because I do believe the unfinished business that he mentions to be true. And that is what it is.
真不，我说这不是一个级别的，那个，这200不算贵，比北京那便宜。我跟北京跳那个，就刚才你们看那视频，那是一个小湖，你知道吧？那个小湖，你给人感觉吧，反正也挺吓人。我操，这他妈面对整个大海，从那往下跳，远处，哎呦，我操，那制空感，妈吓死个人呀！吓死个人呀！这动漫体验是什么？玩3D 啊，这是玩3D。
If you really wanna go, baby, then you gotta take me the mess. I tried to soak in all the years and take it all in, but I come up for a breath and cry. I gave my promise. not